Well, it seems like woke culture is losing and China is the one that's beating it. If you don't know what I'm talking about the developers from other countries making better games from their cultures, so much so that Western developers can't compete. And I'm talking about Wucheng Fallen Feathers coming from a Chinese developer that is trying to get into the industry as many other developers from China are trying to do the same thing by dipping their toes into the gaming industry, and it's coming up with some interesting results because a lot of people are engaged with some of the trailers that have come out from China when it comes to the games that they're producing. I think Wucheng Fallen Feathers is one of those games that have captured the interest of the gamers that are waiting for something that is slightly different from what we've been getting from Western developers. And of course, you've been seeing a lot of imitations of Dark Souls like games, but I think when it comes to China, when they're producing these games, they're leaning towards more of their culture, and I think that's where we're getting the difference now in the video gaming industry, where the cultural difference is going to be the attractive element of the gameplay. And I think when we're seeing these Dark Souls like game coming from China, I'm talking about Black Myth Wukong, I'm talking about with this game as well, Wucheng Fallen Feathers. There's a multitude of other games that are trying to do the same thing from Chinese developers. They usually inject their culture where it makes a mechanical difference, where the interest is higher and more engaging, at least for the fan bases that are looking for something in line with a Dark Souls like game, but a little bit different. I think that's what we're seeing with some of these games that are coming out from China. They're injecting so much of their culture into these games that it seems like a different game in and of itself. And I think that is the opposite of what we're seeing in America when it comes to their Dark Souls imitation type games. You have games like Flintlock, Siege of Dawn that are injected with their own modern day political progressive undertones, where it's just not attractive to the game player because we know what we're getting from these political and cultural standpoints, where it's just not something we're interested in seeing because we see it all throughout our everyday lives. And I think that's the thing that is failing for people when they see something like Flintlock, Siege of Dawn, who has consultancy firms like Sweetbaby Inc. influencing and changing the story and overall race swapping characters and making something that's culturally modern that is unengaging and uninteresting to the audience. And I think that's the failure of Western developers when they're trying to adapt this Souls-like type of game, especially when you're trying to follow in the footsteps of Elden Ring, Dark Souls, Demon Souls from Miyazaki and From Software. It's going to be a difficult thing to do, especially if you don't have an understanding of what makes those games engaging within themselves. It's about the lore, the world that they're creating. It's coming from passionate people that actually love the things that they're producing. And I think when you have this corporate political activist mindset behind the game, it's not going to be as engaging. And I think with China, of course, they are following the footsteps of From Software. They're trying to make a Dark Souls-like game, but I think they inject most of their culture into these games, where you're looking at these games and the art form, the designs. It doesn't really look like a Dark Souls game. It doesn't look like a Bloodborne type of game. It looks like it's injected with Chinese culture, and I think that is the big difference because we're seeing it in the design, the overall look of the characters. I think it's something that is epically different from what we saw from a Souls game, and I think it does something in an interesting way by injecting and including Chinese culture into that element. And I think that's what we're seeing with Korea as well when they're making their similar games. You can see their culture infused into the game. I think culture is a significant thing that is changing the gaming industry right now. If you have a different culture that is not aligned with the Western modern day political activist culture that we're seeing within the Western game development space, you're going to intrigue the game player base because we're inundated with the modern day culture of the West. So we're seeing Chinese culture displayed in a beautiful fashion in a video game with interesting art, design, and elements of mythology. We're going to be paying attention, and when we see these elements infused together with good gameplay and actually beautiful female characters, male female characters, which is something a lot of game developers from the Western side are really not interested in doing, you're going to have the game player base attention. And I think that's what Wucheng Fallen Feathers is doing. It's a game that is bringing all the elements that gamers, and it's injecting a different cultural perspective that gamers haven't even considered. And I think this is the thing that China has an advantage here with these video games that they're producing. They're making something that is interesting and engaging, that has their own cultural impact infused into it, and they know their culture better than anyone else. So we have this game that is doing something that is similar to what we've been seeing, but it has its own cultural elements as well. And you can see from the gameplay, it is very much like a Souls-like type of game. I'm interested in how the gameplay mechanics play out, and especially the story, because you play as a cursed pirate that has a arm that is feathered, has like a demon arm or something like that, and you're taking place in ancient China in the Ming Dynasty, and you have all these story elements with these beasts and monsters and mythical supernatural powers. So it already feels like a Dark Souls type environment, and I'm hoping they do a good job by keeping the unique elements of the game. And I know people were complaining about some of the elements, saying this is a straight rip-off of what we saw with Bloodborne, and I can see the elements. You can see the comparisons right here with Bloodborne and Wucheng, the Fallen Feathers, where it has a lot of story elements, a lot of combinations from Bloodborne. And if you're going to imitate a good game, you might as well imitate the best, and Bloodborne is one of the best. And I just hope they do enough unique things themselves where it's not just a straight up copy of Bloodborne. And I think we may see that just with the overall designs of some of the characters and some things that we hope to see with the elements that they include in this game. I want them to make something unique, so I'm hoping that's the case. We see some things that are similar, but I see them changing the animations where it just doesn't feel straight up exactly like Bloodborne. But we see that comparison. I think it's a valid description and complaint, but I think with a lot of people unable to play Bloodborne because of some of the standards Sony has set, I'm interested to see other people get to play a version of Bloodborne, this Chinese imitation version. I know people call it, if Bloodborne was made by Alibaba, this is what it would look like, and I can understand that complaint. I think this is a game that is aping Bloodborne, but maybe it will do something better than Bloodborne. I think seeing some of the cinematics of this game has me thinking, okay, we'll do some different interesting elements that may have a more solid story base than Bloodborne, and maybe trying to do more than Bloodborne was able to do, because it was still secluded within that kind of ambiguous mythological world that they're trying to set up within that Bloodborne universe, within the Dark Souls like game universe, where everything is not explicit, everything is more implicit with the story. But I like seeing some of the animations, the fighting scenes, and I think China really has a chance of stepping up and taking over the video gaming industry. It's not anything revolutionary, especially with this game, but they have revolutionary games in development, so I'm not mad at them for doing a Bloodborne imitation, because we have Phantom Blade Zero that is doing its own thing in such a way that is so unique and interesting and engaging. I think if you see some of the combat scenes of this game, it's not a Bloodborne type of game. It's a high action, high speed combat game that is doing something on its own that's completely different from what we're seeing from Western game devs. And I think that is the interesting that we're seeing from China. And same thing with Black Myth Wukong, that has its own style of action and combat that is completely different from what we saw from Souls-like games. So we have so much unique properties, not including some of the more fantasy-like games like Infinite Nikki that are more towards a gacha element. So we have so much unique properties coming from China. That's why I'm hyped about this country and this game development sphere, because it's injecting a different culture that is not following the Western modern political progressive standards that have been spreading across the game industry and been a nuisance and kind of been unengaging and uninteresting to the game player base. So I'm excited to see what happens with Wucheng Fallen Feathers. I think it's an interesting game, interesting concept. I think it's just overall something that we need to see in the gaming industry, and I'm hyped to see what happens after this game is released, because it may be one of the key pieces that start the gaming revolution, at least in China. So I'm hyped to see it. Tell me your comments on this game. What do you think? Do you think it's a ripoff of Bloodborne? Of course, I think it's aping it a lot, but I think it's still doing its own thing, probably investing more into the story than Bloodborne did itself and being more explicit about it. So I'm interested to see that version of Bloodborne. So you tell me what you think. I'd like to hear your comments. Like, share, and subscribe. This is Wagner Knows Why. Catch you next time.